Hello, Dad. Thank you very much for agreeing to sit down for a chat. My name is Neil Creek. This is my father, Ken Creek. And we're going to have a little talk about Dad's history. And for this first video, we're going to talk a little bit about his early years in his childhood. So, Dad, would you like to introduce yourself first of all?
Well, I'm Ken Creek. I was born at Horsham on the 4th of May 1935. We lived at 7 Green Park Road, which is now the main road into Horsham from Melbourne, and about 4 houses from the Wimmera River.
All right, so tell me a little bit about your parents. What brought them to Horsham? Who were they? What brought them together?
Well, my father was born at Balrutin, which is not far from Nil. He was a farmer.
What was his name?
Oh, Nigel John Creek. And he lived there with most of the family working on farms in the area. My mother was born at Merino in Western Victoria, but moved to Portland fairly early in her life and lived there in Percy Street, Portland, with her family.
And her name?
Her name is Linda May Walpole originally. She was the third in a family of 4 children. There was Bill, then Edna, then Linda, and Thelma was the youngest.
So what brought them to Horsham?
A lot of the farming community in Nil used to travel to Portland for their annual holidays after they'd harvested their crops. And it was fairly normal for a lot of the people from the Wimmera area to move to Portland for their holidays. It was at Portland that my father met Linda, as did his older brother, who met his wife also in Portland. Linda's father was a plumber and gas fitter, and the house they lived in was built in 1849, only 15 years after Victoria was first settled, and the house was bluestone, and as a gas fitter and plumber, my grandfather had a huge workshop built on the back of the house, and in later years that became a place where we used to spend a lot of our holidays.
Tell me about your early years. What are some of your earliest recollections?
Well, when I was at Horsham, we lived there until I was 4, and then we moved for 1 year to Nil, and at Nil I contracted poliomyelitis and went to have a 3-month stay in the Nil hospital, I believe on the day that war broke out. For a bit over half of that time I was in isolation, and the last part of the time I was in the general ward.
Right.
And
So
while there I also had my tonsils out.
2 for 1. So we'll come back to talk about your polio a little bit more some later. But you have a younger sister, don't you?
Yes, I do. Beverly Dawn
And
was
how old were you when she was born?
2 years and 9 months. While we were at Horsham, Dad ran a small poultry farm, and I can still remember a lot of the activities around the incubators when we were raising the chickens. Well, it was the property itself was fairly small, but we had an empty block next door to us, on which we kept a cow for milk, of course, and I had a dog, a cocker spaniel named Sport, and I apparently disappeared on odd occasions and had the family spending a fair bit of time searching for us.
Where did they end up finding you?
Well, on one occasion I went fairly close to, in fact I crossed an irrigation channel that flowed into the Wimmera River, and within a day or two of that adventure, Sport disappeared somewhere to a nearby farm.
Did your parents perhaps consider him a bad influence?
Well, they considered it a bit of a risk.
Right, yep, fair enough.
But I did have the reputation of being something of an escapee, because I used to dig my way out under the fences. My mum used to tether me when she was hanging out the clothes on the line. And on one occasion, I found my way to the top of a patio arrangement where we were growing grapevines, and I went to sleep there. And that was another occasion when the family had trouble finding me.
Wow, that sounds like you were quite a handful when you were a young lad.
Apparently.
You mentioned before that you had polio. That was when you were age 5, is that right?
4.
Age 4. So tell us how that progressed. What was the early signs? Where did you end up getting treated? How did it resolve?
Well, I can first remember the shooting pains that seemed to go from one end of your body to the other, but particularly down my left side. It's very hard to explain, but it was fairly extreme shooting pains. And then after that, the muscle in my upper left arm and left shoulder paralysed. And when I went to hospital, the treatment was to put the arm in a splint in a rigid position. Now, this is not the way polio would be treated these days. Everything would be done to keep movement going. But in those days, it was believed immobilisation was the answer to give the muscles a chance to recover.
As a part of your treatment for polio, you had to be put in isolation, is that right?
Yeah.
Tell me what that was like for a young man.
Wasn't good at all, of course. I saw my family when they came to visit. They and the nurses were the only ones I was allowed to see, and that was only my parents. It even affected them too, because Mum couldn't go shopping, and so the tradespeople used to bring the produce and leave it on the front fence and whistle her out, and she'd go and collect it from the front fence.
And that was because of a contagion risk?
Yes. And it's hard to explain to people these days, but polio in those days was an absolute dread disease. If it affected your chest, you could spend the rest of your life in an iron lung.
What's an iron lung?
Well, it's something shaped a bit like a coffin, and it had a mechanised means of compressing and decompressing the air in the box to enable you to breathe.
And you couldn't move out of that?
No.
So people who had polio could end up in that for life?
If the muscles and the paralysed were involved the chest. So it was really a dread disease at that time.
So how far did it affect you? Did it spread beyond your arm?
No, just to the shoulder and upper left arm.
Have you experienced any long-term effects as a result of that illness?
Possibly, because as a 12-year-old, I was on a family picnic at Emerald Lake, and took a running jump at a branch of a tree, and I think my grip on my left hand slipped and I fell backwards, and I put my arm down to protect me from the fall, and I ended up jamming my arm between the ground and my body, and it ended up compounding, compound fracture, double compound fracture, with osteomyelitis, gangrene and a Volkmann's claw.
Wow, that sounds like a very serious injury.
Yes.
We'll come back and talk to that a little bit later. Just tell me a little bit about, with your polio, how did it resolve, and what was it like when you came back out of isolation, and did people treat you differently because you had polio?
No. In the last part of the stay, it happened that the nil show was on, and the nurses at the hospital took me to the showgrounds, which were next door, and pushed me around in a pusher. And they actually bought me a monkey on a stick that you could bounce up and down on the rubber, and that was very good. And this was at the time I had my tonsils out, and so I used that monkey a fair bit during my recovery.
Today there's been a growth of an opinion that vaccinating children is unhealthy. A lot of people would say that people who believe that don't understand how things were before vaccines came along. You obviously weren't vaccinated for polio because the vaccine didn't exist at the time. What do you think about the way things are going now with people resisting vaccinating their children against polio and other diseases?
Well, I think there's no question. You only have to walk around any cemetery that had lots of burials from the 19th and early 20th century to see the effect of infectious diseases. Complete families were frequently wiped out, whole collections of children. I just cannot understand those not being willing to vaccinate. As it happened, there are apparently 3 forms of polio, and I, of course, I had only one of them. And so when there was another polio epidemic in 1952, while I was at Melbourne High School, and at that stage we received vaccinations for polio, which of course had covered the 2 strains that I hadn't already contracted. So I feel I'm safe from polio now.
That's terrific. After Horsham, you moved on somewhere else. When did that happen and where did you go?
We left Horsham in 1940, late 41 or early 1942, and went to Hamilton, where my father was working as in the pool petrol. He was considered medically unfit for military service when war broke out because he had what was believed to be a duodenal ulcer and subsequently turned out to be a misdiagnosed appendicitis because the appendix was not located where they normally are. So the result was that he became part of Dad's army and was sent to Hamilton, where he worked on the petrol depot there. And as part of Dad's army, he built a homemade mortar, which they used to use on their exercises.
So for those unfamiliar with the term, what do you mean by Dad's army?
Consisted of people who were medically unfit or too old to serve in the military services. They were still expected to fight if the need arose to protect their own community.
During these years, this was your young years when the war broke out, and obviously you've said already there's something that in a way that affected your family. What was it like living in country Victoria during World War II?
Well, there's a lot of activity going on. Even before we left Horsham, I can remember standing at our front gate and watching the military convoys pass through Horsham on their road to Darwin, which at that stage was under attack from the Japanese forces, who bombed Darwin, Wyndham, Broome, Katherine, and a number of other places in the Northern Territory and Western Australia. And there was a steady stream of military vehicles heading north.
What was the feeling amongst the community when it was understood that the mainland of Australia was under attack?
Well, by the time Singapore fell, there was generally believed to be a high probability that the Japanese would actually land in Australia. And in fact, when I was living at Hamilton, there were occasions when Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, which were launched off Portland from a submarine, overflew Hamilton on the road on the way to Lake Bolac in northern Victoria, where squadrons of Catalina aircraft were being serviced after their, for their overhauls. And I can remember the military training aircraft, Hawker biplanes, that were flying around Hamilton at the time. Also, the school children had their exercises in case of air raid. Adjoining the Hamilton School was the Botanical Gardens, and in the Botanical Gardens they had trenches built, and whenever there was an air raid drill, the students all hurried over to reach the trenches in the Botanical Gardens.
Obviously the war had a big impact on your community when you were growing up. What was it like sort of with the rationing and the austerity that was required as part of a national war effort?
Well, of course, food was rationed. We used to have coupons for things like meat and butter and sugar and flour and whatever, and petrol. And I can remember towards the end of the war, the local Coles advertised that they had chewing gum, but not a packet of chewing gum. You used to buy one tablet.
Wow.
And that was a big deal. There were practically nothing in the way of ice cream, and so we used to have ice blocks, not much more than frozen cordial, and frozen bananas were a fairly big deal with the school kids in my younger days.
What about toys and leisure activities?
Well, toys were almost unknown, of course, during the war. There was very little in the Christmas stockings for children in those days, understandably. There just wasn't much around.
And what did you do for fun, for entertainment? Were there movies?
Yeah, but not very much during the war. The school children the boys basically had 4 seasons. There was conkers, marbles, parachutes, and another weird game we used to play using pocket knives.
Oh, you have to tell me more about that.
Well, you would mark out a rectangle on the ground and a line dividing it into 2, and you would stand on one half and your opponent would stand on the other. And the idea was that you would throw your pocket knife into the other person's territory. Then you would draw a line parallel with the blade, and the portion that joined your territory became your territory, and he had to stand on what was left and shoot back into yours. And this went on until somebody had a piece of territory too small to stand on, and that decided the winner.
Were there ever any injuries?
No.
I can imagine some feet would have gotten stuck every now and then.
Well, I can't ever recall any of that happening.
So they were all very good throws?
Yeah, they were pretty good, yes. I can remember arriving at school at the usual time, and we were just about to go to class, and the school bell rang, and the headmaster came out and told us that the war was over and that everyone could go home. So we all headed off home.
So how did your town celebrate?
Well, I don't know so much about the town, but I know that there were great celebrations in the family. I can remember towards the later stages of the war, I asked my parents what were they going to talk about on the news when the war was over, because almost all of the news during the wartime was to deal with, military activities, and I couldn't imagine what it was they could find to talk about on the news.
So how old were you when peace was declared?
10.
Do you think that your experience growing up as a war child had an impact on the rest of your life?
Yes, I think it did.
In what way?
Well, it's a bit hard to explain, but perhaps a greater awareness that that things can change pretty dramatically in a fairly short space of time.
Did the austerity of the period affect you?
Well, as a child, you weren't terribly conscious of it because you weren't old enough before. I wasn't old enough before the war to know what it was like before the war, and it took some time after the war for things to get back to what would perhaps be considered normal. I mean, in my slightly later years, in fact, I'll go back and mention that in the final stages of the war, my father moved to Melbourne, where he got a job as working in a plastics factory at the same place that my Auntie Thelma worked. And I can remember him flying home to see us every month or two. And then not long after the war ended, we moved to Melbourne to join him. And at that stage, my sister and I went to Camberwell Central School, where we lived, and we lived at that time for 1 year with my cousin. Housing was in very short supply in the immediate post-war years, and so we were very glad to be put up by her for a year while we settled into Melbourne. My father found that he got dermatitis from the powders in the plastics factory and found that he could no longer work there. So he, and as an ex-farmer, he had skills relating to farming only, and so he used the family vehicle to become a Rawley salesman. Now, Rawley's is almost unknown these days, but in the early post-war years, they had a number of products which were in fairly short supply and were reasonably popular. Things like sago and mustard ointment and a number of other, perhaps more dubious medicinal products.
Right. So you told us a little bit about your father in that time. Tell us about your mother. What did she do before she married, and what did she do after?
Well, before she married, she was a dressmaker, and later on in married life, she made clothes for the children, Bev and I, and also my aunties and grandparents. She was very accomplished at that, and at the time when my father was doing the Rawleys, he started carrying or selling some of the babies' outfits and women's blouses that my mother made, which she used to smock. Now, smocking is a term not known widely today, but it's a form of fancy stitching which was very decorative, and it was used a lot on women's blouses and babies' outfits. And my father soon found that in the days of clothing rationing and the shortage of clothing generally, that he was actually making better income from what Mum produced than he was from Rawleys. And so he gradually phased out the Rawleys and moved into men's industrial clothing, like overalls, lab coats and the like, and heavy sort of workman's outfits. And he continued that for the rest of his working life. Gradually, as that business picked up, he gave my mother a break by no longer selling all her hard-working materials.
So you were a handful when you were living back in Horsham. Did that continue when you'd moved to Hamilton?
No, I seemed to grow out of the runaway habits when I was a little bit older.
So how did you keep yourself entertained?
Well, the things we used to do at school was sometimes we continued them at home, but I can remember walking on stilts was a big deal, and we used to do a lot of that. One of the other activities that we had was when we were going to, my sister and I were going to school in winter, we used to tread on the puddles that were frozen, the idea being to seeing whether or not you could avoid breaking through the ice and getting your feet wet.
It must have been very cold up there at night.
It was pretty cold overnight, yes.
That makes me ask about the modern conveniences we take for granted today, like heating and cooling and refrigeration. What conveniences did you have when you were growing up, and what came along as you grew up, and how did it change your life?
Well, while we were at Hamilton, there was no such thing as refrigerators, even ice boxes. We used to have a Coolgardie safe. Now, what that was a four-sided safe with metal surrounds, perforated metal to allow air to flow. You had a container at the top which was maybe a couple of inches deep, filled with water, and you hung hessian straps hanging over the side, and of course the water seeped up to the hessian straps and down over the perforated holes in the metallic coating of the Coolgardie, and air passing through that was cooled by evaporating the water, and that was our only way of keeping food cool. And
did that succeed in keeping things safe for long? Like, could you keep meat for very long?
No, it was mainly for things like keeping butter a bit firmer and maybe keeping milk for a few hours more than it otherwise would.
So you'd find that you'd need to be replenishing your food supplies very frequently?
Yes. Yeah.
Terrific. What about other things? Was Hamilton or Horsham electrified?
Yes, Hamilton was at the time when I was there. However, I can perhaps just mention that the home that my mother grew up in Portland, was still operating with the gas lighting at the time when we went there on holidays as children. Because my grandfather had been a plumber and a gas fitter, the whole house was laid out with gas lights. So it was a bit of an experience to walk into a room and strike a match and light the light.
I can imagine. All right, so you mentioned to me earlier about how you taught yourself swimming. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, well, while I was at Hamilton, we used to go, my mum used to take my sister and I to the local swimming hole, which happened to be a stream, the name of which I've forgotten at the moment, which was not very wide. But I taught myself to dog paddle by swimming parallel with the banks, and then the middle was out of my depth. But as I gained confidence on the dog paddling, I eventually swam myself over and back. So I never really did learn to freestyle properly, but that's how I learnt to dog paddle. Oh, I used to go fishing a lot with my father when we were at Hamilton. We used to go fishing for redfin mainly in the Wannon River when I was, 8 to 10. And we had an interesting experience there. My sister, at this stage, would have been 4 possibly. My father and I were sitting by the banks of the river fishing, and I was on a little camp stool, and from beneath my feet a tiger snake passed between my legs and slithered into the water. Well, my father, who's had a fishing rod which was made out of an old tank aerial and therefore very whippy, so he quickly wound the line in and went after the tiger snake, which by this time was in the water, protected by the roots of a tree where the water had partially eroded away the soil. And he managed to fish the snake out between the tree roots onto the bank where he killed it, or where he beat it with his fishing rod. And we hung it up on the fence, as was the tradition for snakes in the country era. A short while later, my sister, about 4 at the time, came bearing a piece of bark with the snake still on it, and the snake still alive. It had a broken back not very far behind the neck, so it hadn't bitten her, but had she not been so lucky, it could well have done so. And a tiger snake is amongst the most venomous snakes in the world.
So very fortunate call there for Beth.
Yes.
All right, so you moved to Melbourne. How old were you when you moved to Melbourne, and what was the experience coming from the country into a city?
Well, I was 10 when we moved, and the biggest building in Melbourne at that time was Myers, which I think at that time was 7 stories high, and we were amazed because I think the tallest building in Hamilton at the time was only 2 or 3 floors. So yes, it was a bit, and also of course the volume of traffic. Melbourne at that time had a population of about perhaps 1.25 to 1.5 million. It's now 5.
So what day-to-day experiences in Melbourne were different from your home in Hamilton, getting around town, the public transport, or?
The main means of getting around town in those days was tram, and we happened to live on a tram route, so if we wanted to go to town it was a matter of going by tram. There were trains, but in my earlier days we didn't use them as much.
What school did you start going to?
We went to Camberwell Central. I started there in grade 6 and finished in grade 8, which was the end of the central school.
Do you have any experiences from that time in that school that you'd like to talk about?
Well, of course, I broke my arm while I was there.
All right, so tell us about that, how you broke your arm, and tell us all about your recovery from that.
Yes, well, in November 1947, the family had a family picnic at Emerald in the Dandenongs, and there would have been something like 30-odd family members present at that time. And shortly after lunch, I went for a walk with several of my cousins, and there was a tree which had been felled, but the trunk remained at about 7 or 8 feet above the ground, and the rest of the trunk was sloping downwards to the ground. And I took a running jump at one of the branches, and my grip slipped. I think it's possible that it might have been the weakness in my left arm which caused that to happen. And in trying to protect myself, I put my hand down and jammed my arm between the ground and my body, and ended up breaking the bone in such a way that it was compressed like a snake. There were 3 bones. The 2 bones were broken in 3 places, and I was taken to Ferntree Gully to a doctor there, and from there admitted to Ferntree Gully Hospital, which I understand is now a maternity hospital. At that time it was a general hospital, and I had an operation that evening to try and straighten my arm. Now I was told that the way they did that was they tied something from my wrist to the door handle and slowly applied a little bit of pressure to pull everything out straight. And they then did whatever they needed to do to try and repair it. Now, it was a double compound fracture, which means that the bones came through the skin. It was because one of the bones had two breaks in it, the island piece in the middle subsequently rotted with gangrene. When the bone had gone through piercing my skin, it had also torn the tendon, so I ended up with a Volkmann's claw, which is the tendon on the front and the back of the hand. Because they're now out of balance, it was pulled right back. So for the next 3 weeks I had a rather difficult time with the gangrene, and I was one of the first civilian patients to receive penicillin in 1947, because up until that time penicillin was in short supply and was restricted basically for use by the military. So I was very fortunate.
So that probably saved your life from the infection. Yeah,
I would have died had it not been for that, with all of the gangrene.
So how old were you when this happened?
12.
And I remember you from our past, you've told me what it was like for going under surgery. The anaesthetic they used at the time was different from today. Tell me about that.
Well, the anaesthetics in those days was ether. It's a bit hard to explain the sensation I got, but I always felt it was a bit like somebody had you by the heels and was swinging you around inside a big concrete conduit with your head hitting the sides as they did so. It was a sickly, sweet smell, and when you finally went out, of course, and it was administered by dropping raw ether onto a cotton pad located near your nose. So they put your nose through a slit in the cotton pad and then just dripped it down the side. A most unpleasant feeling. And then when you were recovering consciousness after that, it was very nauseating, and there were kidney bowls galore.
So you said you had a 3-week difficult period while you were recovering from the immediate aftermath of the injury. How long did your recovery and rehabilitation take after that, and what did it involve?
It would have been another 4 years before they finally said, no, that's as far as it's going to go. When the initial recovery took place, I found that I couldn't distinguish which finger was which. The nerves had grown up and grown together in such a way that when the nursing staff touched one finger, I would identify it as the wrong finger. And so they had to do another operation, which they called exploration of the ulnar nerve, in which they sorted the nerves out and connected them up in such a way that I could tell which finger was which.
Now today you wear a glove over your hand to protect you. Could you hold up your hand to show that? So describe to me now the results of the injury and how it affects you today.
Well, you can see the bend there. That bone was the one that had the two breaks in it, and the piece missing was removed. I think they probably should have replaced it with some sort of tube to guide the bone together so that when it grew it did a slightly better job. This incision that you can see from there to there was the exploration of the ulnar nerve. There were 13 stitches across that, and after the operation it was placed in plaster of Paris for 3 months, during which time the portion here, the gangrene rotted that bone away, and you could smell me from 50 metres away. when they realised that there was gangrenous, they removed the plaster, which had been on for 3 months, and then they cut down the row of stitches and pulled them out individually. And I was swooning continuously. Yeah, so that wasn't very pleasant. And that operation, incidentally, had been on my 13th birthday.
Wow. So why do you still wear the glove till this day?
Well, as part of the happenings that, all of this occurred, was I lost a lot of the layers of my skin, and it was hypersensitive. Now, if I hold it firmly, it's okay. If I just brush something, it drives you up the wall. So I use the glove primarily because of the sensitivity issue, but also in winter it helps keep it warm, because otherwise it gets very, very cold.
So the circulation isn't as good there?
The circulation is not good.
Yeah. So after all that surgery, what was the ongoing process of rehabilitation for you?
Well, at this stage, I still had the Volkmann's claw, which means that everything was pulled back like that. And so I had physio at the Children's Hospital, which incidentally was then in Pelham Street, Carlton, not the current Children's Hospital. I received physio 5 days a week, which involved dislocating each joint in my fingers to prevent arthritis from freezing them up, and also to try and get it straightened. So part of the procedure of trying to straighten out my hands from the Volkmann's claw was a plaster of Paris framework split in two, so that it was two pieces that went together, and then you had to strap around the outside to hold the whole thing together. And out the back of that was 5 wires, and around at the end of each wire there was a loop of rubber bands and a leather pad, and they went over the tips of your fingers and pulled your fingers back. And that was an extremely painful procedure, and I had to leave that on for, perhaps an hour at a time. And when you let it off, it was not fun at all. So that went on for about 12 months. And then after that, I still continued physio, but it was back to 3 days a week. And after that, they just said that there's no further progress possible. So,
and has the arm changed in that time? Is it worsened or improved?
Well, I finally removed the framework when I was about 16.
So you had the injury when you were 12,
so, yeah.
And you removed the braces at age 16. Were you wearing it the whole time?
Yeah, pretty well the whole time.
How did that affect your life?
Well, obviously you're handicapped on what you could do. You try not to let these things interfere with your life too much, and I still continued doing things. I used to high jump even though I had my arm in the plaster, but I was limited in that I could only do scissors. I couldn't do the straddle, which was the high jumping style that was becoming popular at the time, because that involved landing with your hands as well as your legs, and obviously I couldn't do that.
Okay, and in the years since you've had the brace removed, has the arm changed at all?
No.
So it's been pretty constant?
Yeah, it's been pretty much the same.
And how does it affect your day-to-day life today?
Not incredibly, because I've learned to adapt to the things that you can and can't do. I've always tried to be protective of it, because I've known that if I broke it again badly, and any break it would almost certainly be badly given the current situation, that I would almost certainly have lost it. So very early in my time after that, I learned the means of protecting it. So if I ever fell, the first thing I did was pull my arm in against my body. So whereas most people would put a hand out to protect themselves, mine automatic reaction was the other way, to try and protect my arm.